So next up is Ina Ganguli, Associate Professor of Economics and Associate Director of the Computational Social Science Institute. Her research is on labor economics and the economics of science and innovation. She received her Ph.D. from Harvard University, M.P.P. from Michigan, and B.A. from Northwestern. In 2018, she received the Russian National Prize in Applied Economics. She's been a U.S. Embassy Policy Specialist Fellow in Russia, Azerbaijan and Tajikistan, a Fulbright Scholar in the Ukraine, and a Bundestag International Parliamentary Program Fellow in Germany. Her talk is Does Location Matter for Knowledge Production? Evidence from Migration, Meetings, and Multiples. Please welcome Ina Ganguli.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, to get started, I wanted you to take just a second and think about the last great idea you had. So think about a paper or a grant proposal, and now think, did you come up with that idea after talking with someone or maybe going to a conference and meeting a collaborator? And that's actually a lot of my research has to do with thinking about what we think about as knowledge flows that can be facilitated by being in the same place. So for example, here, you're with colleagues, you're having some conversations, you might meet a collaborator, you might learn about a new paper. And I like to show this New Yorker article, hopefully you can read this. I see by the current issue of Lab News Ridgeway that you've been working for the last 20 years on the same problem I've been working on for the last 20 years. And what you see are two scientists, their backs are facing each other, and this is supposed to show what science shouldn't be like, right? We're supposed to talk, and the idea is that face-to-face interactions can really matter. And so for economists, we call these knowledge spillovers, and these are actually really important for thinking about how ideas are generated and what leads to long-run economic growth. Now, the challenge is that it's really hard to measure these, and it's really hard to provide evidence of these. And Paul Krugman has a well-known quote where he says, knowledge spillovers are hard to measure because they leave no paper trail by which they can be tracked. And so in my work, I wanted to tell you about kind of three different sets of projects where I try to kind of look at this paper trail to try to show that does it really matter for knowledge production if you have people meet face-to-face. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project on migration that tries to show that immigrants contribute to the diffusion of knowledge, particularly tacit knowledge. So this is knowledge that's not written down or codified. And then I'm going to look at meetings. So this is things that we all do as researchers, as scholars, going to conferences, right? So face-to-face interactions, do they matter in particular for forming collaborations? And then lastly, I have some new work that's looking at multiple invention. And so this is when you have simultaneous ideas. And some of you may have experienced this. This is what the New Yorker cartoon is about, that maybe you're scooped, right? Like there are people who are working on the same idea, but we're going to try to show that being in the same geographic location actually increases the likelihood of that. So the first project I want to talk about is about migration. And so here I use the Russian case, or the collapse of Soviet science. And here what I leverage is that basically when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had suddenly a big opening, and you had a lot of migrants coming, particularly to the West. And so these are a few cases of Nobel Prize winners in physics in 2010, trained in the former Soviet Union, but then went to Amsterdam and Manchester. And then this, I like this, was from an old, I think, Science article where you have the leading expert on mammoths who couldn't come to the US. It took him 16 years, but finally he was able to come. And so what I do is I basically use data on scientists and their publications and their citations. And what I show is that if you look at migrants, so people who left the Soviet Union, if you look at citations to their Soviet-era work, they actually increase after they come, for example, to the US, compared to scientists who do not leave the former Soviet Union. So this graph kind of shows, you probably can't see it, but relative to when they migrate, the migrants' articles are cited more. Okay, the second context that I look at is meetings, okay? And so this is where, with co-authors, we really want to try to understand how do collaborations form. And this is a really difficult question to look at because we were just talking in the back. When you go to an event, you often you're drawn to the people you already know or who are closest to you in scientific space. And so it's really hard to actually estimate what's the impact of being co-located. So we did a field experiment at Harvard Medical School with 500 researchers where we basically randomized people at an event to different rooms. And so then we could look at people who were randomly in the same room versus people who were not. And then we actually had them wear these sociometric badges to track interactions. And then what we did is we followed up to see who ended up collaborating on a grant. And so this is a regression, and the red is basically showing that if people were in the same room, they were much more likely to collaborate subsequently. Okay, and then the last contexts are multiple. So this is some new work I'm doing. You might recognize these folks. This is Alexander Graham Bell and Alicia Gray, and they basically were both almost simultaneously inventing the telephone. And this is something called a patent interference. So I'm working with a data set where we have thousands of these cases. And what we wanted to show is we wanted to see if these interferences or multiples are more geographically localized, that might be evidence that there's some tacit knowledge in the air in these locations. And so this is one of our results where we have distance on the x-axis, and the y is the density. And what this shows is that interfering inventors, so these are people who are, again, involved in these multiples, are more likely to be geographically co-located, which suggests that there's some knowledge in the air. So to conclude, the idea is that from these different contexts, they all seem to suggest that co-location and face-to-face interactions do matter. So it's great you are here and talking to your colleagues. Thank you.